Okay, good afternoon. It is September 11th, 2023. It is 5:05 p.m. Welcome to the San Marino Unified School District Board of Education special meeting. And here is your board president, Shelley Wright.
Thank you, Dr. Choi. Thank you. San Marino Unified School District Board of Education special meeting. All meetings of the Board of Education are open to members of the public unless publicly noticed as a confidential closed session as allowed by the Law Education Code section 35-147. Members of the public may address the board as outlined in the public comment section of the agenda. The audio of all meetings is recorded. A member of the public may be held liable for any slanderous or otherwise defamatory statements. In consideration of the board and members of the audience, please silence your cell phones while in the boardroom. The San Marino Unified School District encourages those with disabilities to participate fully in the public meeting process. If you need a disability-related modification or accommodation, including auxiliary aids or services, to participate in the public meeting, contact the assistant to the superintendent at j.delatory@smusd.us or at 626-299-7000 extension 1310 at least 48 hours before the scheduled board meeting so that we may make every reasonable effort to accommodate you. Under Government Code Section 54953.2, Americans with Disability Act of 1990, Section 202.42, Section 121.32. Documents provided to the majority of the Board of Education regarding an open session item on this agenda will be made available for the public inspection in the district office located at 1665 West Drive, San Marino, during normal business hours. In addition, such items and documents may be viewed on the district website at www.smusd.us. I'd like to open up our meeting now to call to order. Can everyone stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance?
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. May I have an approval of the agenda versus an action item? I would approve the agenda today. Thank you, Mrs. Hill, and who seconded? Mrs. Lynn, thank you so much for that. And with that, I'd like to do roll call and also the action item. Mrs. Lynn, Mrs. Hill, Mrs. John, aye. Mr. Chang, aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. And the approval of the agenda has passed. Public comment. The Board of Education has adopted board policy 9323E to ensure the public will be heard in any matters pertaining to the San Marino Unified School District. Public comment is limited to only those items listed on the special meeting agenda under Government Code Section 5495413A. Persons who wish to provide public comment will have three options to submit public comments. First, you could have submitted through an online form. Was there any submission?
We had no submissions.
Okay, no submission today, and they would have been provided to board members and they're not responded to. Request to speak during the meeting by the Zoom. Dr. Choi?
Okay, we'll go ahead and pause for 1 minute to take requests to speak. If you'd like to make a request to speak regarding matters that are on the agenda, go ahead and press the raise hand icon or dial *9. We have 30 seconds remaining. If you'd like to make a request to speak, please press the raise hand icon or dial *9.
Hey, President Ryan, we have no requests.
Thank you, Dr. Joy, and emails request to speak during the meeting in person via the comment card. At this time, we do not have a card, so let's move on. Communication from the audience regarding matters on the agenda are to be made at this time. There are any such comments. With that, I'd like to begin the board study session. The Board of Education will participate in a board study session wherein representatives of FM3 will present their recent bond feasibility survey results and answer any questions the board may have. This is a discussion item only.
Good evening, board members. My name is Adam Sunshine. I'm a Senior Vice President at FM3 Research. We are glad to have been asked to work again with the district to conduct a survey of the likely voters in your community. I'm going to take you through the results and happy to answer any questions that you have or any clarifications we can provide. To start with, let me just share with you the methodology of how we went about doing this survey. We did this in basically the middle of August. The folks that we spoke to were all considered likely to vote in the 2024 November election based mostly on their past voting history. So in other words, these are people who have voted before or they're newly registered in your city and would indicate some interest in voting in an upcoming election, or in your school district, excuse me, not in your city. The total sample size was 322 survey interviews, which means we had a margin of error plus or minus 5.5, basically. So keep that in mind as you look at some of the results coming up later. We reach people in a variety of ways to try to reflect the fact that there are differences in communication preferences these days. So we did phone calls with live telephone interviewers, reaching people by cell phone and landline. We also sent emails and text messages to folks to take the survey online. Okay? And people could do either the phone or the online. They couldn't do both. And the online survey is not like one of the ones where you might see on Facebook or another social media site where somebody posts it and anybody can take it, or you could take it 50 times or send it to your friends to take it multiple times. It's protected, so each person who receives the link can only take it once. We are going to be tracking some survey results to results that we did for the school district back in 2016. And then just so you know, the survey was available in both English and Mandarin. And you might see at some point something doesn't quite add up to 100% or the percentage that you're expecting because we've rounded decimal points. Okay. So let me start with just some initial attitudes on the school bond measure for San Marino Unified. We start with a conceptual question, one that we find is really important to understand, and that is, do voters have a belief that your district has a need for additional funding? Probably, well, depending on your eyesight, you may or may not be able to read the question that's written at the bottom of the slide, but that's the actual question text that was asked. Generally speaking, would you say that the San Marino Unified School District has a great need for additional funding, some need, a little need, or no real need for additional funding? You'll notice that we're not speaking specifically of facilities or of any other purpose, just at a conceptual level, high level, do they sense that? And if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, you'll see a little under 2/3 of voters would perceive that the district has at least some need. And that's sort of what we're looking at, that great or some need together. About 23% would say a little or no real need. 13% of the respondents were not sure. And if you look at the left-hand side, that's the 2016 survey results. And interestingly, they're fairly similar, right? 7 years later, while they might have changed in between, we're basically where we were at that time. Now, in order to gauge the viability of a bond measure, we find that the best way to do that is to test a hypothetical ballot measure. As you know, when voters go to vote, they get their ballot in the mail, they see a 75-word ballot question. There's lots of other materials that will be involved, but for some people, that's all they're really looking at. So we want to focus there. You can see we put together a draft for this survey to give us something for your voters to react to. There's a title there, the School Repair Upgrade Safety Continuation Measure. We do some illustrative examples of the kinds of improvements that could be made from this bond, knowing that there's no way we could name everything that could possibly be done within 75 words. And then there's some legally required language in the middle there. It's talking about the authorization size of the bond, which in this case was $200 million. The levy, which is $60 per $100,000 of assessed value, the annual revenue, which is almost $12 million. And then some of the accountability provisions that are built into the measure, but it's helpful to remind voters that that's there. So the oversight and the all monies for San Marino schools. And you can see at the beginning, we're talking about maintaining, repairing, upgrading your schools, that there be no tax rate increase. And that's an important consideration here. And then some of the other improvements, leaky roofs, restrooms, heating and cooling, security, earthquake, fire safety, et cetera. Okay. Here's the initial response to that ballot question. So nothing else other than what you just saw. Would they vote yes or would they vote no on that measure? We are basically finding your voters right at the number that would need to be voting for this in order for it to be approved, which is 55%. You know, for this kind of measure, you need 55% for approval. That's exactly the percentage of respondents who would support this on the initial read. 37% would vote no, 8% are undecided. Now, to break this down a little bit further so you understand some of the variations in intensity of that support, if somebody said yes on that ballot question, we said, is that definitely or probably? If they said no, we said, is that definitely or probably? And if they said they weren't sure, we asked if they were leaning yes or leaning no in one direction or the other. In order to get to that 55%, you see 37% definitely yes, 13% probably yes, another 5% we're kind of leaning towards voting yes. That would say to us, this measure starts in a position where it's worth future consideration, worth continuing to work for, but clearly not a slam dunk, right? Particularly in a survey which has a margin of error of about 5.5 points, right? We're basically right in the middle of what's viable and or not, but we're at a starting point where you're kind of in the game, right? And there's work to be done, and with that work, you'll see later in the presentation, the measure has a greater chance of success. Okay. Give you a little bit of sense of kind of the breakdown in support here among different communities, so you understand a little more context. What's interesting to us as we look at these results is the consistency in support in different communities. So self-identified racial or ethnic background, the voters who identified as being white, 56% of them said that they would support this measure, and they make up, if you can see it underneath that column, it says 35%, make up 35% of the likely voters in the district. Okay. Those who self-identify as Asian or Pacific Islander, 55% support it. They make up 51% of the likely voters. And those who chose to take the survey in Mandarin, 60% support it. So really, there's very little difference here among different racial and ethnic communities within the district. By age group, we see at least a plurality of voters in each age bracket who are supportive of the measure, but clearly those who are under 50, a little more supportive than those who are over 50. Not uncommon for a school bond measure, right? Those under 50 more likely to feel a direct connection to their local schools. And you can see in your community, about 41% of the likely voters are under the age of 50. Okay, so that's not that uncommon to see this kind of spread. What is a little uncommon is what we see in this slide. And this is the reactions to your measure among district parents and those who are not district parents within your district. So SMUSD parents are the voters in our sample who have kids in your schools. This is not a representative sample of all parents, so I want to be clear about that. There are some parents who are not voters. There's some parents who, for any variety of reasons, weren't participating in the survey. But those parents who are participating in the survey, their opinions on the measure are basically the same as the voters in the district who are not district parents. And that is something that's unusual. Oftentimes, we would see the district parents much more supportive than those voters who are not part of the district. So that says to us that there's some internal communication as well as external communication about why the district would be pursuing this measure that's necessary. We also group together people who are current district parents, former district parents, or grandparents of current or former district students. And that's that group that's kind of on the third group here. And then on the far right, those who have none of those connections to the district. And statistically, they're not that different, although interestingly, those who haven't yet had kids in the schools or don't have kids at all are even a little more supportive than those who've had their kids go through the school. Sometimes that group on the right-hand side may include some of those younger voters who I showed you on the last slide, who are a little more supportive. Okay. And then here's why we think the issue of the need for additional funding is so important. As you follow this slide, you can see on the left-hand side that 25% of your likely voters who think the district has a great need for additional funding. 84% of them said that they would support this bond measure. Okay, almost unanimous. They think you have a great need for additional funding. If you think the district has some need for additional funding, the next set of columns, that's 63% yes to 25% no in favor of the measure. As we go to the next two columns, you see it's almost the mirror opposite. You think the district has just a little need for funding, you're opposed to the measure at 64%. And if you think they have no real need, you're opposed to this at almost 80%. So really and then those voters that don't know one way or another, which is about 13% of the electorate, they're trending towards the no side. They're not kind of giving you the benefit of the doubt. They don't know if you need money, and then that's not good enough for them to support this. Okay, so if the district were to pursue this and do community outreach and education about why you're pursuing it, one of the issues would be helping voters understand that there's at least some need for funding. One of the important things we did in this survey is try to get a better understanding of what your voters' priorities are within this ballot measure. We tested 75 words and we put a few examples in there. There's a lot of things that the district could be doing with this funding, as well as provisions that could be included from a kind of accountability standpoint. So what's most important to the people, to the voters in your district? Again, not your parents specifically, but all of your voters. And on this slide, you've got extremely important in the dark blue, and then very important is the next color blue there. We've taken those two and we've grouped them on the right-hand side. And the real light blue is not just somewhat important. The red is not too important, and the gray is don't know. And so if you look at the top of the slide, what you're going to see is a couple things that are related to fiscal accountability. It's not really about how the money, what sort of improvements are going to be made. It's that there's going to be public spending disclosure, and all the funding is going to be used for San Marino schools. That's very important to almost 80% of the voters in your district. Okay, and if you look at the somewhat important, the light blue, it's another 13%. We're almost at 90% who would say those are important attributes of this measure. And if you look almost at the bottom of the slide, you just see that broad phrase requiring oversight. Similar kind of language, not as important as the public spending disclosure, but still over 2/3. And you'll remember 55% said that they would support this measure. So 20 points more are saying these things are important to them. Okay. Now, if we look at the actual ways the funding would be used, there's things like upgrading classrooms, labs, and technology that support college and career readiness, sort of a thematic point that's really important to a lot of people, almost 3/4 of voters saying that that's important. And then you see some kind of basic repairs language, ensuring safe drinking water, repairing leaky roofs, outdated electrical systems, upgrading fire safety, repairing damaged ceilings. All these are things that strong majorities of voters are saying are important to them. And if you look at the red, less than 10% are saying they're not too important. And very few voters are saying they don't know. That gray, you can see that there's just kind of a sliver down the right-hand side for most of these items. So for the most part, it's sort of the accountability, it's the college and career readiness, and it's the basic repairs. Those three things are grouping together to be the real priorities for local voters for a San Marino USD bond. Continuing on this same question to look at some of the other items, as I said, we tested a lot of things. You see a couple of items that aren't exactly ways the money is going to be used, but sort of attributes of the measure, and that's making the state eligible for potential matching funds, maintaining and upgrading schools with no tax rate increase, right? Those two are both in there are close to 2/3. And we start to see some security and safety items coming in here as a theme. So Upgrading security cameras, 66% say that that's extremely or very important to them. Another 17% say somewhat important. Down near the bottom of this slide, upgrading school safety and security. It's 61 extremely or very important, but notice the dark blue 35% extremely important. For those people who care, they care a lot about safety and security. It's a real strong priority for them. There's just some folks who are maybe less worried about it. I guess it's not that they don't care about safety and security, but they're assuming in your community it's not as big of a concern as it is in other areas. And then there's some other kinds of repairs, flood damage, outdated plumbing, et cetera. You can see also classrooms, labs, and technology that support student achievement, science and engineering labs, air filtration systems, and different kinds of priorities working their way in there. As we get to kind of the next tier of priorities, we're getting closer to that 55% vote on this slide, and some of them even ticking under it. Air conditioning in school gyms and auditoriums, 61, safe playground equipment is 60, earthquake safety, outdated restrooms, outdated classrooms, water conservation. All these are sort of modest in terms of prioritization, not to say there are things you shouldn't be doing as part of your bond, because there may be needs that you have. But when you ask your voters what are the top priorities, these are not at the top of the list. Okay. Same with replacing outdated portables, same with upgrading the arts, music, and drama classrooms and performance spaces, or the school drop-off and pickup zones. Okay. All right. Now, we know that over the course of the several months between the time that the board would choose to put this, or between now and when the board would put this measure on the ballot, there'd probably be some information provided to people about why you're doing it. There may also be some folks who organize and try to oppose it. I want to give you a little sense of how that played out in the survey, because we tried to simulate some of that information. I'm not going to try to read all the words on these slides for you, but you should just know we tested a series of statements that are the kinds of statements that the district could be using to help voters understand why you're pursuing this measure. And the themes of those measures are in parentheses there in the dark blue. And the question is it very or somewhat convincing as a reason to you to support this ballot measure that you've been hearing about? Okay. Several of these are strong messages that really resonate with a good number of voters, particularly at a measure where you are starting at 55% yes. You have 80% who would say they're very or somewhat convinced to support the measure based on a statement about repairs and upgrades. That's that first one. And you saw in the prior slides how important some of those basic repairs were to people. So there's a consistency here. Fiscal accountability, which you also saw in some of the prior slides as an important kind of individual priority. Now, when we group it thematically, also really important to your voters. We tried something you didn't see earlier in the earlier slide, which is about property values. That your schools and continuing to have them be high performing is important for maintaining local property values. And 70% of the respondents said that that was a convincing reason for them to support the measure. And then some of the kind of next tier of statements, not quite as strong, but still above kind of the starting point of the measure. Talking generally about the district being a high performing district and the need to continue the tradition of local support for schools. The fact that there'd be no tax rate increase, you'd just be maintaining current local tax rates. Safety and security aspects of this measure, as well as the improvements to classroom technology, which you can see didn't get the most intense response. The dark blue there is about 23, but in overall, very or somewhat convincing was quite strong. Okay. Now, we also gave people an opposition statement, which mentioned all the things that you would expect to hear if this measure goes forward, right? At $200 million is too much money. The district doesn't need it. They're all well off. You know, the taxes are too high. Now's not the time with inflation. And so we simulated both, but starting with what happens when we provide people that information from the district's perspective first, we can see a pretty strong support in feelings about the measure. So whereas it started at 55 to 37, we gave people that series of statements of, that could come from the district, and it went up to 64 to 27 when we re-asked. This is a pretty big increase and an uncommonly high increase. We don't typically see 9, 10-point jumps just from information, particularly on on a measure like this where the undecided wasn't that big to begin with, right? We were under 10% undecided from the beginning. And now you can see at this 64% to 27, we're at 59%, just looking at the definitely and probably, not even counting those leaning voters. And at 64% with a margin of error that I mentioned earlier of basically 5.5, you're outside that margin of error when you're looking at a 55% threshold measure. So this says if the district kind of does the work of communication, outreach, et cetera, there's the opportunity to really build support and grow that support. Now, as I mentioned, we also simulated some opposition, and when that opposition kicks in, some of those opinions revert to where they were at the beginning of the survey. So we were at 55 to 37 at the initial vote. That went up to 64 to 27 when the district provided information, and then opponents came in and gave their side of the story, and it kind of went back to where it was before, 56 to 34. You know, it's an interesting kind of exchange, but I think one of the things to keep in mind is that we've simulated what most often happens with school districts, which is the district does the communication and outreach first and lays the groundwork for telling your story of why you would be doing this, does the outreach to the stakeholders, and then opponents come in later and try to knock it down. So opposed to the other way around, which is the district stays silent, just puts this measure on the ballot. Opponents have the whole field to themselves to tell voters why they think it's a bad thing. And then the district is left scrambling, trying to kind of rehabilitate opinions on the measure. Wanted to share with you the viability of the measure in the March primary. And by looking at the subset of voters in our sample who were likely to vote in March, what we see is it's really not a very good option to look at the March ballot. You really want to look at the November ballot, at least from our understanding at this point. We obviously don't have a crystal ball to what November 2024 would look like, let alone March of 2024 from a economic standpoint or other things that might be happening in the community. But just looking at the historical trends of who's likely to vote, so the March electorate is less supportive of this measure than the November electorate, and that's not uncommon. And you saw that those younger voters were more supportive of the measure. Well, they're more likely to vote in a general election than a primary historically. Also wanted to share with you how these results compare to what we saw in our 2016 survey. 2016 had a little different story. The measure started with a high level of support, but actually the more people heard about it, the less they liked it. And by the end, it was at 52 to 41. In your case, in the current survey, didn't start as strong, but reached a higher threshold at 64% and held on at the end at 56-34 above where the survey ended and the measure ended in the 2016 survey, which was 52-41. So ending in a better place now than the measure was ending in the 2016 survey. So I'll do a couple of quick conclusions. Happy to take your questions, and then if Joy's listening, Joy, I'll take survey questions and then turn it to you to talk about timeline. So just quickly, we find that the measure is viable for further planning, and that's I want to just really make that distinction clear. Not to say you can stop doing any work and come back and just put it on the ballot and it's all is great, but there's a window here and an opportunity with a measure that starts and ends right around that 55% threshold that hopefully, if the district is interested in pursuing this, you have the opportunity to build that support. Have a harder time being successful in March of 2024. It's got lower support really throughout the survey. About 2/3 perceive the district has at least some need for additional funding, which is a reasonable place to start. And then throughout the survey, there were some key priorities and themes that were identified. The need for basic repairs, fiscal accountability, upgrades to classrooms to prepare students for college and career, providing safe drinking water at schools, and then some of the safety and security upgrades. I don't want to overemphasize that. Some of the things were kind of lower priorities, but there were some things we tested which were fairly high priorities. Okay, so I'll stop there and maybe take any questions you have about the survey itself, and then Joy will chime in with a timeline. I'll go any order unless the board president wants to pick for me. Go ahead.
Okay, the last page you mentioned about you are doing the spring before.
Right, how it would look in the March 2024 election. Yes, right. So we were looking at both possibilities within the same survey. March is not a good option. You should look at November.
So November is better.
November is better.
And second question, the sample size 322. How did you decide?
Yes,
Position?
so it's a good question. It's a mix of what's possible, given the number of voters in the district, the budget available, the time available to do the survey. It's also what we did last time, and we find that a sample of that size for a district like yours is helpful enough at this point to give you the context you need to know, are we in the ballpark or are we not? There's only so much kind of fine tuning we can do at this point. So we were actually trying to get 300, got a little bit better response than that as voters were even more interested in participating. So we feel good about that sample size.
The 300 sample is significant, which within the school district we have about, I think it's 14,000.
I have to check my numbers, but that sounds about right. So yeah, we do feel that it's significant with that margin of error, right? So on any question, we couldn't statistically rule out that it's, 5.5 points lower, 5.5 points higher, but it's more likely to be around the item than the number that we pinpointed in the survey.
And the 322, what is the age?
Oh, yeah. So what we did was we replicated the age distribution of your likely voters. What we did was we pulled a sample that replicates the ages, the genders, the racial and ethnic diversity, regions of the district. So I can tell you that we had 16% who were under the age of 30, 12% who were 30 to 39, 13% who were 40 to 49, 27% who were between 50 and 64, and then 32% who were seniors. And that's replicating again what the expected likely voters are in the November election.
And also the one of the page you even mentioned about grandparents.
Yeah.
So you are able to identify.
Well, we asked. We asked. We don't have the ability to identify, but we did ask specifically if they had any children who previously attended, or if they have any grandchildren who currently or previously attended San Marino Unified School District schools. There were not many in that category, but we did ask that. I think there was a question over here. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Actually, Joseph asked many of the same questions that I had, but one of the other ones that I had is, was there any overlap in terms of the sample size? Maybe the same individuals that were surveyed back in 2016 that were also surveyed now?
It's a good question. We didn't actually look into that. We can follow up and try to find out. We pulled them as independent samples. As you know, many people have moved into the district since 2016. Many people have moved out or no longer registered to vote. So I suspect there's not a lot of the same people, but it's possible that there were a few people surveyed in 2016 and again today.
Right, and further to the sample size, I know it's 322, and Joseph mentioned maybe about 14,000 populate. Is that the population or the registered?
That would be the likely voters, and we can double check on that. I don't remember offhand.
Do you have it broken out, the percentage and change of the parents and non-parents once they were given more information?
I do. I don't have it at the desk right here, but I do have that information. Follow up and get it. Okay, I don't see more questions. Oh, yeah.
Sorry,
That's fine.
with regards to the survey questions, are these questions similar or the same as what was asked back in 2016?
Yeah, very good question. Some of them were asked to be exactly the same. Like the one I showed you, which looked at the need for funding from that time to this time, is exactly the same wording, and that lets us see what differences there were from there to here. On other questions like the actual 75-word ballot question that we posed to people, the wording's not the same. We asked the question the same way, which is, in other words, we said, hey, here's this measure that could be on the ballot. Let me read it to you. Would you support it or would you oppose it? That question is the same, but the wording of the ballot measures, we modified it based on what we know and what has changed over the last 7 years. Similarly, the themes that we tested, there may be some similarities, but they're not exactly the same.
So one of my thought process is that the end result seems to all fall back into those around 55%, with your last few slides showing that the differences in the trend.
Yeah.
So I'm interested in seeing the data comparison 7 years ago and 7 years now to see why overall there's still a 3% drop, it looks like, from your very first slide of support for 64 versus 67.
Oh yeah, okay, maybe I can go back. You're talking about this one?
Yeah. Oh no, the very first slide.
Okay, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, you're talking about that one. Yeah, so in 2016, we asked just about need for funding compared to today. We asked the same question. Statistically, to be honest, these are not very different. We would say they're kind of interchangeable at 67 or 64. I don't know that there's a real data trend that we could look at. We could analyze some different groups of voters and see if there was some differences that might be more stark. But to us, 3% is pretty similar.
I have a question about the amount that you inserted. If we don't have a facilities needs assessment, I mean, that number, it's clearly a placeholder number, but could that have impacted how people respond? So
our general finding, and I know that this was part of the debate a few years ago, is that the big authorization number, which in this case was $200 million, tends not to impact people's vote, because whether you said 190 or 200 or 150, it just sounds like a lot to most people. What might impact them though is the tax rate. So you'll see we talked about a $60 per $100,000 tax rate, which is what the district is eligible to be asking for. If we were to ask about much lower amounts, it might have produced a higher level of support. Sometimes yes, to be honest, sometimes no. Even it's sort of like you're in or you're out, whether it's $60 per 100,000 or $50 or $40, sometimes it doesn't make that much of a difference.
Idea about the reason for failure last time. I mean, 67% is a pretty strong yes. And so people didn't like the plan and the district didn't communicate. Is that kind of? Yeah, so I'll do two things, and Joy, I know wants to chime in as well, and I can see your hand. I want to be clear, when I'm showing you this one, it's not a yes vote on the measure, 67. It's just a need, right? And even in this case, the need was 64, but the vote is 55, right? So it would, also that was 2016, your measure was 2020. So there's some time in between. And that election was probably in the way it works out, just not the right time. But since I wasn't really involved in that one, I'll let Joy jump in and maybe she wants to share more there.
Thank you. Good evening, members of the board, superintendent, members of the cabinet. Joy Coomer with Team Civics. I apologize, I couldn't be there in person. As you may know, I have COVID, and although I'm doing much better, I just wasn't yet negative to travel. So thank you for the opportunity to participate virtually. So first to the question of the total amount of the bond that we tested, the 200 million. I wanted to answer that question just by saying that that is the maximum amount of the bond size that the district could go for without increasing existing tax rates. And it has been the interest of the district not to increase tax rates up to this point. there is an opportunity after we're done here for LPA to speak to a little bit of the feasibility that we're going through right now and the facilities master planning. I'll introduce them when I'm done. But, you know, until we know the final amount that is needed, which I'm just going to say, based on work that we've done before, will likely be more than 200,000 or 200 million, excuse me. 200 million was the placeholder that we did decide to use this time because it was the maximum amount. If the district were to choose to go for a lower amount, that is something where we would address as we go through this process over the next several months before we get to that November ballot of 2023. Speaking to the election in 2020, there was, you know, controversy within the district about the size of the bond, whether it should be 100 million or 200 million. And at that time, there was a facilities needs assessment committee, just as you have now, an FAC. But, you know, there wasn't an independent architecture firm that was hired to work on the very specific numbers needed. And so the split in the community was really about a bond size because there was not agreement on what projects needed to be done. A lot has changed both since 2016 and since 2020. I think the district has really undergone a lot of changes. We are going through this process in a very thoughtful, transparent, and open way so that people understand both the facilities needs assessment. We have much more communication and outreach planned to the community. Before the communication was, it did exist. There were meetings that were held at many of the school sites, but it was really in just the final months before the board voted to put it on the ballot. It wasn't this thoughtful year-long process that we're going through now. So hopefully as we continue through this process, you know, we'll find the right dollar amount that should go on the ballot, and we'll be able to make decisions that help us be successful and different than that March of 2020 election. If that answers that question, I'd be happy to go through my slides very quickly and then introduce LPA. Next slide. Thank you. So I wanted to, I just was speaking about this year-long process. And you can see in order to qualify for the November 5th, 2024 ballot, the district and the board would need to vote on a resolution and deliver it to the Register of Voters before that August 9th of 2024 date. Right now, we're really focused on the feasibility. All of this was just to help provide information to us and to you about how the community feels about this bond. We've gone through this process before, back in 2016, decided not to move forward. The district did move forward in 2020, but did not have a survey at that time. And so now we're really taking a very thorough and different approach than we have in the past. This survey will help us understand how to move into those next two phases, the awareness building and the measure development. That means really thinking through how we're going to do outreach to the community using the insight and the information that we've obtained from the voter survey, because we do see when people have information, that information is very powerful and it changes people's minds. And so I think that is going to be critical to us through the end of this year and early next year, those non-advocacy communications and community building. The facilities master planning process is going to be continuing as you go through this, and that will also help us refine both the project list, the scope, the full amount of the bond. And all of these things will lead up to that date, which actually likely will be a June date of 2024, when the board would actually vote. Between now and then, we'll have far more base opportunities where I'll be there to talk to the board. I'll work with the FAC and the rest of the district staff as we get ready and keep moving towards that timeline so that we can make adjustments so that this bond proposal both meets your needs and the community's values that we've seen so far. Next slide, please. So these are just our immediate next steps. We had this opportunity here to do the study session so that we could, hear from you, answer any questions you have about the survey, about the timeline. We recommend that you move forward with our phase 2 contract to begin that public outreach and community consensus building. Continue with the facilities master planning process with LPA. And then as we go through these next few months, we'll begin some of this outreach, including we've discussed doing some open houses and some other ways to engage all of the community, including some of those critical older voters who we saw weren't as supportive in the survey, and also parents, and bring everybody to the table so that they understand the need and are a part of this process. So that concludes my slides. Again, happy to answer any questions. After me, I will introduce LPA, who will be talking about where we are in the facilities master planning process right now with a quick update.
Any questions or comments at this point? Do we have a date on when the facilities master plan?
I'll go for that. We have a schedule that I can.
Before we get to that, I have a question. Do we have any updates as to the California state bonds and whether or not anyone knows when those are on the ballot? It will be on the ballot in November 2024 for the state.
If it goes on the ballot. Yeah, we have to do the polling for the statewide groups that are leading the statewide school bond effort. So that's the target, would be November 2024, but it's still in process.
Thanks. Good evening. Sorry. Okay, good evening, members of the board, President, and Dr. Delatorre. Thank you for having me here tonight. It's a pleasure to see you all again. We've been very busy the last month or so since the last time we met, and I want to just go through a review of all the things we've been doing and allow you to ask some questions about the process. So this is a little difficult to read. That's our schedule. And as you recall, when we first started the process, there wasn't a decision whether a March bond or a November bond was going to be appropriate. So we wanted to put together a process that could conclude by the end of the year. We now know that there is more of a desire to push that and do a November bond, but we still have a process that you can see that will end sometime in January, and it could actually move into February as well as we move through it. Making sure we move cautiously and making sure that we want to reach out to all the stakeholders that we can. So there's a lot of stars and bubbles and circles there. It's not, don't expect you to understand all that, but what I'll do is I'll walk through the things we've completed to date. We've brought and gathered a lot of information. We've learned a lot about the sites. We put together site diagrams. We put together the committees, and we started doing some of that committee interactions, and it's been really great. We've got a lot of good information. Just to start with, we do touch base with the leadership group, which is Dr. Delatorre, Dr. Lim, some others as well, just to make sure we're going through the right process. And when we started that, we just wanted to touch base from a high level, just to kind of get a test of where the leadership was in the district. And these are the things that resonated in terms of need. And you can see flexible learning spaces, safety was big, traffic circulation, campus perimeter security, especially at the high school, technology, digital access, and sustainability. So that just gave us kind of a very high level overview of the things that were important to the leadership. One of the things that we did is we asked the district to form school site committees. And we've already run through those processes. We've met with each of the school sites. The school site committees consisted of the principal in some cases, some instructors, the custodial representative, and PTA and parents were actually part of the committees in some sites. What we did is we brought in the site plan and we brought in red dots, green dots, and we said, tell us what you like about your school, tell us what you don't like about your school, and just gathered a whole bunch of information. Then we walked the school sites with the group, and it was really insightful. They were really appreciative to be asked a question earlier in the process. And at a very high level, some of the results that came out, as you can see at Carver, they're currently at maximum capacity. They really feel like they have a need for more classrooms, especially replacing the portables with maybe a permanent classroom building. They need better lunch space. And when we walked the school sites, it happened to be one of the hottest days of the year. So the common thing we had at all the sites were shade. Shade was really important. So we documented that. Valentine, you can see NPR and food service spaces were important. Replacement of the portables again. Their library is very tiny, so they would like a much larger library, and shade again. When we met with Huntington Middle, modernization of the older classroom buildings, more office and conference spaces, outdoor learning spaces, areas. Carver has a benefit. They have a lot of great spaces where the kids can go outside their classrooms and learn. I think the other school sites would like that kind of space as well. And then restroom modernizations were high. San Marino High School, there is quite a bit of need. As you all know, the athletic complex is probably the highest need there. The two gyms are very old and outdated. The aquatic center doesn't really serve you well. It's undersized. So there was a kind of their high need was to replace that whole area with new facilities, new gyms, and perhaps a new aquatic center. All without touching the Adobe, keep that where it's at. And then reconfigure some of the older classroom buildings to address safety. There's some classrooms that, kind of front the streets, and there's a lack of confidence to use some of those classrooms because of their exposure. Modernization of their auditorium and the whole VAPA area that could use a little bit of work and love. So that was identified, and then just modernization of some of the other spaces. Those were just a quick overview results of the site committee. Now that's just our initial review. We're going to be meeting with them again. And as you'll see, we're going to be forming, when we meet with the we have educational visioning next, but I'll touch on when we get back together with the site committees, but they're going to have another opportunity to interface with us, actually a couple more opportunities. So we put together, we met with some representatives of the district from an educational standpoint, and we asked them a bunch of different questions and what has been the most exciting educational shift in the last 5 to 6 years. And you can see these are just some of the things. We had survey questions and they were able to use their phones and answer the questions, and it created these word clouds, or they're called Wordle sometimes. So you can see the larger the word meant, the higher the answer in terms of the word recognition. So collaboration was big, technology, resources, Zoom, use of Zoom and remote learning and online learning. Those were the things that kind of resonated from the big shifts from about 5 years ago. And I'm going to run through a whole bunch of series of questions that we did ask. So with this particular group, you can see we did a similar thing with them where we had different questions, and then they were writing responses on Post-it notes, and we had examples of types of learning spaces and outdoor spaces, and they were clipping them down, putting together what they thought was a nice kind of a way you could do a teaching space. So it was an interactive process. And so one of the things that we talked about is how does the space hinder, how does your space hinder or help achieve the 3 educational goals: exemplary teaching and learning, flourishing learning environments, and meaningful and authentic connections. And where do we go from here? So basically update technology, having flexible furniture, outdoor learning spaces with shade, counseling meeting rooms, more modernized restrooms. That came out of that session. We also asked more about the learning spaces at the elementary. And these are some of the things that came up: dedicated spaces for music, art, and maker spaces, flexible seating, mobile interactive display, shade outdoor learning areas, PE space. Sustainability came up in terms of having a green campus and the idea of having some solar panels and solar areas for shade and potentially in parking areas. Maintenance, of course, easy to clean flooring, technical surfaces. So the idea is that we're trying to get thoughts from a lot of different perspectives and put it all together so we know from a wide variety of stakeholders. So we also asked the same group about learning spaces in the middle school. These are some things you can see came out very similar. flexible furniture, technology, writable walls. We like the idea of having all surfaces being used for learning as opposed to just having one key marker board. More areas for collaborative group space, individual and pair workspaces, outdoor wellness center with shade. Wellness came up quite a bit. And then we then put our focus on M&O group, and we met with the district for a very long session where you brought in all of your folks that do, with Gil and all the different maintenance folks, the people that handle grounds and repairing HVAC and electrical and locks, doors, windows, paint. And we went through each site and we asked them to rate all the areas, and they used a series of red dots and green dots that represented things like sewer systems, toilets, electrical, HVAC, and they literally marked up the whole plan. And you kind of get a heat map of what's great at your a particular site. So it was very insightful. And then you can see there's a bunch of topics on the right-hand corner of the little sheets, and they added notes. We told them just mark things on sticky notes. So we gathered a lot of great information from that group as well. Then we had our first meeting with the Facilities Advisory Committee, and we've got a series of 4 meetings with them. The first one was more about informative, about talking about the process and outlining what's going to happen in the future. And that group was really interested in making sure that we did touch all different stakeholders and community members. So they're holding us to make sure that we get as much different outreach as we can. We did ask them a bunch of different questions as well. And the first one had to do with describe what you think is unique about San Marino USD communities, about your community. And you can see another word cloud. Community comes high, family, supportive, cleanliness, diversity, safe. You can see all the things that they did when they gave their responses. We asked another question, what was your favorite place in school? And these are the kinds of things that came out. Very wide variety: gym, the ceramic studio, auditorium, quad. You can see classrooms, fields, band room, library. It's just interesting to get their perspective of what is important in a school site. Now we asked, what's your favorite thing about San Marino schools? And again, similar things: the community, the teachers, students, parents, they're safe people. You can kind of see all the things that resonated. We asked the question, in 1 or 2 words, describe what is your impression of school facilities in San Marino. And you get kind of a different perspective here. The top word we receive is aging, outdated, old, falling apart, dilapidated, 50-50 good to old, red tiles. Yeah, there's lots of red tiles for sure. Inconsistent, which tells me that there's a lot of, maybe there isn't, all the facilities have, kids have options to have similar facilities across the district. We asked another question, 1 or 2 words. What do you think is the top priority for facility improvements moving forward into the future? And you can see kind of a wide range of things from safety, HVAC, flexibility, upgrading the technology, science-focused technology gyms at the high school, consolidation, upgrade, money, air conditioning along with HVAC. So we got a pretty good feedback from that perspective. So in terms of, those are just really, that's what we did the last month or so, or literally the last 3 weeks. So we've been really busy gathering information, seeing things from different perspectives. Coming ahead, we're going to have 3 more Facilities Advisory Community meetings. You can see the next one comes up on September 21st, then December, and then 1 more in November. We are planning a communities partners meeting. That's to be determined. That came out from the first FAC meeting, saying that there's a lot of community partners that we want to make sure we engage. So we're going to try to do that in a couple of different ways. The first time we'll do just a similar kind of thing. We'll bring together all the partners and run similar activities, ask them what they think the needs are, what's your impression of the schools, and we'll get their thoughts and what the needs are here. And then we'll bring them back again later once we have our first draft plan to get their thoughts on that too. So it's another way to reach out to a kind of a wider net of representatives. We've got community and student surveys pending. This will be some kind of online survey that well, I think we've given you a draft, the district's looking at those now, and we'll send those out. That'll be an ability to reach out to every instructor, custodial folks, administrative people, and parents and students alike. So that's a really nice way to get a lot of different perspectives from a lot of people in a very simple way. We're going to do educational visioning follow-up meetings. So we'll, in terms of the things that we've learned, we'll go back to them. And then, as we mentioned, other outreach as we need to. So, and we'll come back to this group again with the goal would be when we get to sometime in December-ish, and that's why when you get towards the holidays, things may move into January, but ultimately we'll bring back together a draft plan. And once we have our initial draft plan and get some input from the Facilities Advisory Committee, that's the first time that we'll start doing our initial cost estimate of all the needs across the district. Then that advisory committee, along with the school site committees, will come back to a much larger group, and they'll have the draft plans to look at, and we'll ask that group to do some prioritization. You mentioned the 200 million and what's the right number. We don't know what that number would be based on the need, but I can tell you from the master plans we do up and down the state is the need always exceeds the funding available. So that's just the nature of what we're doing. We're trying to do a comprehensive plan. We're giving you a long-term plan that you can use for future. I haven't seen a plan yet where there is all the money available to do all the work. That's probably not going to happen. But the thing to think about is we're also looking at the district. They're going to have, you'll likely have some state eligibility. So if the state bond does go on the ballot, you'll be able to leverage your local dollars with some state dollars as well to hopefully maximize that. But when we do the prioritization and we bring that back to you, we should have that number. We'll know what the bond number is, and we'll know what the potential state eligibility is. So if we say you have this much need, and I'm making a gesture of a big number here, then you'll be able to prioritize to within the amount of dollars that you believe you'll have available. So that'll be a difficult meeting, but it's always interesting to see where that lies. So that's coming up more in December, January timeframe. I know I went through a lot of things very quickly, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
For the San Marino High School, so you guys already have some of the need in mind. So, okay, can you go back to the page for San Marino High School? Yeah.
Let's see. Go to the site committee one. I think is where we.
When which.
Maybe I want to pass it. Here we go.
So, what is the definition for the new aesthetic complex?
So the way that was approached, and just so you know, we had a site committee at the high school, but about a month and a half before that, we actually met with the outgoing principal. So we were able to get his thoughts, and he obviously knows the site very well. So I wanted to make sure you knew that we actually had that information as well. And there was a lot of consistency between what he believed the need would be with the site committee. But the thought was that the two gyms are very old and aged, and they don't meet the needs today in terms of the way you want to do competition. So a new athletic complex, the way we will look at it from starting to test fit these things would be likely a brand new gym facility that would have both a large and small gym and all the locker facilities and perhaps some PE training rooms all in one building. And given the fact that you do have, your site isn't very large, and because of the Adobe, that it'll likely be a two-story potential, and that's something common that we've been doing in other sites. So we see that being a new athletic facility to allow enough space then for a new competitive aquatic center.
About the modernization of the auditorium, is that rebuild or that's a remodel?
That would be, at least the way we've been understanding the needs there, would be more of a remodel. It wouldn't be.
How about I remember the last time, so they checked and there's an issue because of I think if we remodel then only cut I think major portion need to touch and then will trigger to the
Seismic work perhaps, or
what we call I forget the organization, but they regulate
the Division of the State Architect.
Yeah. They said when trigger to DSA, so anyone have to review is that true or not?
Well, every project you do will be reviewed by the Division of the State Architect, DSA. So there's a very small little ability for a district to do work that you can do without the Division of the State Architect or DSA. So any kind of project you do will likely trigger their review. Now, there's different things that they review. They're responsible for three things: fire, life safety, structural, and accessibility. So those are the three things that once you do a project, then it triggers certain work that has to be done throughout your campus, like path of travel for accessibility. So those are things that we understand, and we'll have that as part of the costs when we present costs to you.
So, my question is for the earlier presentation. I'm sorry that I should have asked if Joy was here. You've gotten this data, and it's a small slice, 322 compared to a population of 14,000. But at any given time, you may have 3,500 voters come out for this particular vote for the bond. So I'm wondering, what is after you've gotten the data, what's the strategic thinking versus your strategic planning now that you've got this data? Because remember, we've already gone through a little bit of a history of 2016, 2020. And so when I see the plan, email, to have a town hall, to send out a flyer, which is the same thing we did last time. And I know that there were different issues that happened last time, but it feels like we're almost doing the same thing, because we took a very small sample and we had, you showed us what the plan was. We had town hall, we had the flyer, and then so what is the strategic thinking behind what data you got, and then how do we plan?
And your question is about the kind of the outreach plan, like how would you reach out to voters and kind of explain what the district needs are and those kinds of things? Okay, so is Joy still there?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm gonna let Joy answer that.
Hey, Joy, it's
Yeah.
Shelley.
Hi, Shelley. I heard your questions and comments, and I understand the concern that the plan doesn't seem substantially different than what we did last time in 2020. I have to keep thinking of my years, what happened when. But I think it's important to keep in mind that there were two things that were very different from last time than this time. The first thing is we had a survey in 2016. It was a presidential election year for a November election. And at that time, the ability to do a no tax increase bond was very limited. And that was part of the reason that the district decided not to move forward in 2016. There was some resistance to raising taxes beyond what they were already being paid for the previous bond work. There was also a lot of work and pieces being moved about the athletic facilities. And I know that the athletic center then started and was moving along. And in 2019, when we came back and started looking at a bond again, there was, real concern about being able to finish that and complete the work. And, we started looking again at this bond, but at that time we didn't do a survey. We didn't take the opportunity to work on a facilities master planning, such as what's going on with LPA right now. And most of our work was really condensed into a very tight window. We started planning really in December of 2019, intensely, even though we had done some work in the fall. Like everything was just very, very condensed. And it just didn't allow us to really get that feedback and apply it as part of our process. I also, believe that some of the feedback that we got, that we received from some of our town hall meetings and from many of the other activities that took place, there was a feeling from those community groups that they were providing input and their input wasn't being taken. And I think that really hurt us. It hurt us in credibility, and it created an opposition for a potential bond measure that maybe otherwise wouldn't have existed if some of the feedback we had received would have been implemented. And the most basic one of those is that, many people felt like the bond would be better if it were only 100 million. Again, they felt like the work that had been done by the Facilities Advisory Committee in 2019, though interesting, wasn't a real view into the needs facing the district, and it wasn't a real project list that identified the dollar amounts attached to the particular projects. And that question of the size of the bond and matching the projects, in addition to a myriad of other things that had nothing to do with the district's bond, because March of 2020 was a very difficult year for school bonds statewide. But that really contributed to some people being opposed to it, and it just hurt us as we continued to move forward. So my vision for, when we're talking about town halls, when we're talking about whether or not to do a piece of community mail, all of this is about that community engagement and taking that information back and helping it form our process and our decisions here, so that whatever ends up on the ballot really is that alignment between your priorities and the community's priorities. So it may not be a $200 million bond. It may be something that's a little bit less, or maybe because of all the work that's happening with LPA, we discover that you really need 500 million. And, 200 million, seems incredibly reasonable to the community. I just think we have a different team, a different process. It's very open, it's very transparent. And so the work that we do is going to be reflected in where we end up. And that's what's going to make it different from 2020.
If I could just underscore one thing that Joy said, not to disagree with anything, but she mentioned that it was a challenging year for school bonds in March of 2020, which is underselling it somewhat. It was the worst year for school bonds in the history of California by far. There has not been anything close to the level of failure of school bonds in March of 2020 ever, before or after. And what we've seen since then is that bond measures are passing at much closer to their historical average in the state. So you got caught in addition to all the other things that happened, I think you got caught in a sort of anomaly of an election for reasons that you couldn't possibly have predicted when you put the measure on the ballot, because it was all things that happened a month before, 2 weeks before, a week before, that you just had no control
over. So one thing that I'm finding is a little bit of a disconnect that hasn't come up yet, and I'm just thinking back to some of the past responses from the community, is there's a little bit of a disconnect for me when I look at what the people say they look for. They prioritize accountability. In that survey, we saw that accountability was a huge piece of it. And then when we're with the site committees, they're actually talking about the education of children and facilities. There's a disconnect, because when we look at the data of what people are going to prioritize when they're actually voting, the facilities are at maybe 60%, but that accountability factor is up in the 70s. So what I'm not seeing at this point is I recognize that all of us do here because we know the law that the general obligation bond requires an oversight committee, a citizens oversight committee, but I really think we need to push that out as part of our messaging more, because that we're making an assumption about what the community already understands is required of this, and it's making them question and doubt how this is used. And I think that was two parts of it. So the part of it is the facility master plan saying these are our priorities. Now, here's where we're going to make sure we're actually spending the way we're supposed to. Here are the mechanisms and pieces we're going to put in place to ensure that this district is going to be fiscally responsible with these monies, because these are huge amounts of dollars that don't really mean anything in the real world, but is going to mean something when they vote yes or no. So I think that we need to start thinking about how to incorporate that into our messaging more and be very upfront and very obvious about it, because if that's the number one thing that they're talking about in that survey, and that hasn't come up at all in what we're actually going to do to meet that concern, then I think we're missing a piece there.
So I just want to, so I agree with you 100% that all of our communications will really talk about the project list, will really talk about the fiscal accountability. It is something that I think is very important. And that's why I use the word transparent and open as well. I think that that is something that the voting population really appreciates in this process. But that work is a little bit separate from the work that LPA is doing. They're really focusing right now on, you know, having people sort of think about the facilities very particularly and imagine how can we make these facilities better and serve our community and our students better. So they may not necessarily talk about the project list right now or the fiscal accountability or the oversight, but those are pieces as we bring all this together. When you get the final facilities master plan, as we continue our communication and outreach, it will evolve and become a piece of everything that we say and do. So it's this is part of that normal process. And I think that they will coexist together very well as we continue to move forward.
It's my understanding that in your surveys, you're going to find what the appetite for the amount is with the community. And then on the other side, we're going to have the facilities needs and then value engineer back our way into the amount of money we have in our priorities. Is that, am I sort of understanding that correctly?
So it's pretty common. Yeah, it's pretty common for school districts to go through a facilities master planning process and discover that the needs facing schools, which, you know, as we saw, are very old, and there is a need for a lot of different, especially as education is changing, different layouts, different education spaces for students. Oftentimes, in fact, I would say 90% of the time, the need, the amount that is found to be needed in the facilities master plan is much higher than a district's able to actually go out for in a bond. So most districts do have to go through that prioritization process, and they do have to sort of think about what is our first phase, what are going to be our priorities for this particular bond, and that is part of the process that we'll be working on over this next year. This facilities master planning is going to give us our roadmap, and then as we begin to work to put together a potential resolution for a bond, there will need to be some priority decisions made.
And I feel like it's really important to really understand San Marino, though, too. I feel like our community likes things of high quality, but not flashy. And I mean, some of the feedback from the VAPA auditorium last time was literally, we're not Arcadia, we're not Beverly Hills. Like, we are who we are, and it makes us special, but we're not best of the best of the best. We don't actually need that to be so competitive. And I mean, obviously we're performing so well now that we just want to give our students, you know, more, I don't know, more capabilities to compete, but we're still doing fine, and I want people to not feel like they're also doing too much or putting this down, or just understanding the community, I think is really important.
I agree with you 100%.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time.
Thank you.